Welcome to Zion Fellowship's Bible Wire. In these podcasts, we discuss what the Bible says, line upon line and precept upon precept. Today, Ben Allen,
that's me,
will be continuing our study on the book of Obadiah. Settle in for the next few minutes and learn more about who God is and how he loves.
Hi everyone. Last episode we discussed the prevailing accusations leveled by Obadiah to the Edomites, his intentional word choice of, quote, on that day of calamity, and the prophetic imagery that spell out God's vindication for his people. If we could just pause for a second, just from an organizing standpoint, the first 9 verses, Obadiah was leveling the punishments of the Edomites. But in the verses 10 through 14, this is talking about what crime did the Edomites commit to justify the preceding 9 verses of punishments. Well, in this final episode of the Obadiah track, we deal with the downfall of guilty Edomites within a wider perspective. A substantial part of the prophetic literature of the Old Testament is concerned with eschatological expectations. Eschatological is just another way of saying the end times, the book of Revelation kind of stuff, in which the themes of the day of the Lord, or rather the day of Yahweh, and his people's domination of other nations come to the foreground. It is to this larger hope that our prophet now not unnaturally turns in climactic conclusion. Relating his own theme to the great traditional framework of the future, he is still much concerned with Edom, but shows how his special message fits into the eschatological pattern of God's final triumph. The conquest of Edom, already predicted, is now presented as a signal inaugurating that traditional widespread demonstration of divine justice and grace, which is associated with the day of the Lord, or rather the day of Yahweh. In verses 15 and 16, it's important to remember Israel's hope through the eyes of the Old Testament. They look forward to a time when Yahweh would finally intervene in the human affairs and set right this wicked world. A time when the man-centered world system would be brought to its knees. This future period, when moral debts would be settled and Yahweh openly revealed to all as the upholder of right and justice and the victor over sin and violence, was called the day of Yahweh, or rather the day of the Lord. A basic and traditional part of this eschatological motif, again, theme, it's just another way of saying motif, was the participation of the people of God in his victory. In verse 16, the prophet offers as some consolation for the scattered survivors of that catastrophe the prospect that justice would certainly be done, and those nations involved in the guilt of that international crime would be brought to justice. The figure of the cup of wrath is used in Hebrew literature to express God's judgment. It says in Psalm 75:8, "In Yahweh's hand is a cup of foaming wine, heavily spiced. From it he pours for all the wicked in the world to drink, draining it right down to its dregs." For the Christian, the figure has a specially sacred significance, because Jesus used it in the Garden of Gethsemane in his poignant prayer, "Take this cup away from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." Mark 14:36. The point of illustration is that the victim of divine wrath is set reeling, as helpless under its poignant influence as a drunkard man. Psalm 60, verse 3 says, You have given your people a bitter drink. You have given us wine to drink that made us reel. As in that psalm, the affliction of the people of God is here in view. The prophet addresses his sorrowing audience with a word of implicit comfort, direct from Yahweh. The community had indeed been punished for its sin. And from this point of view, the fall of Jerusalem was God's own reprisal against a rebellious people. But as a loving cup is passed from one hand to hand, so it was to be with this cup of wrath. It would, in due course, be the turn of the other nations. Isaiah 51:17 through 23. A commentary on this present verse includes a promise. It says, quote, "You will drink it no more. I shall put it into the hands of your tormentors." A charge of sacrilege is leveled against the oppressing forces. Agents of God's own wrath, though they were not themselves guiltless. Jerusalem, the golden, set apart for the worship of Yahweh, had been vilely desecrated. No respect had been paid to this blessed sanctuary. God's honor had been besmirched in the ruthless trespass upon holy ground and in the looting of temple ornaments and vessels. Obadiah echoes the age-old Zion theology which had been reflected in the oracles of Isaiah long before. Now, I want to tackle verses 17 and 21 as a theme of their own that are Zion dominant. With the prophet Obadiah having dispatched the last bit, he proceeds to the next divinely ordained future. The desecration of Jerusalem having been avenged, the next step is to now rehabilitate the sacred site. Moreover, mention of the complete overthrow of the nations is followed naturally by contrasting the fortunes of the Jews, who, after the Babylonian onslaught and its aftermath, were left as comparatively a small remnant. Obadiah looks forward to the time when Jerusalem would become demonstrably free from violation, immune from a repetition of the previous outrages deplored earlier in the poem. Joel 3:17, in citing this verse, correctly interprets the sanctity of Jerusalem as the prospect that, quote, aliens will never again pass through it, end quote. It is said elsewhere of Jerusalem, the holy city, there will enter you no more, the uncircumcised and the unclean. This hope of a future of Jerusalem befitting its special status in the purpose of God fills the hearts of the post-787 generations of the covenant community. The fortunes of Jerusalem and the land of Israel are inextricably linked together. Worship in the temple of the holy city was the key to the blessing of the whole land. The possession of Mount Zion as Yahweh's abode is closely connected with the right to dwell on the land. Yahweh's holy hill as a symbol of Yahweh's land, and to worship on the one carried with it the privilege of dwelling on the other. Moving now to verse 18, the onslaught upon Edom is an unfolding of one aspect of their reclaiming of territory from which it was dispossessed them. The general theme of reinstatement is applied specifically to the region of Edom. Like the last stanza, this one echoes the previous section in its use of the term survivor, which significantly was used of the Judeans suffering at the hands of the Edomites in verse 14. The superficial reader will view this piece as a simple statement of Judah's destruction of Edom. A knowledge of the usage of the key terms fire, stubble, in the Old Testament, though, reveal a far deeper level of theological content than appears on the surface. Over and over and over again, separately and together, they connotate, again, namely fire and stubble, They connotate God's judgment of the wicked. The ancient Song of Moses already reflects this usage in describing the defeat of Pharaoh's army. Exodus 15:7 says, "You released your fury, and it consumed them like stubble." Isaiah applied this imagery to the cosmopolitan Assyrian army, which threatened Jerusalem in 701 BC. It would be reduced to drifting chaff, Isaiah 10:17, and Yahweh would visit them with, quote, the flame of a devouring fire, Isaiah 29:5. John the Baptist similarly defined the role of the Messiah as an agent of divine judgment. Quote, he will burn the chaff with unquenchable fire, end quote, Matthew 3:12, as well as Luke 3:17. The present pronouncement stands firmly within a consistent biblical tradition in its use of the metaphor of fire and stubble. And now finally, in the final verses that I haven't covered already, in verses 19 and 20, it has a promise of the territorial expansion of God's people in all directions until they regain their ancient territory. The old promise of the land is reaffirmed as the implicit corollary of the restored covenant of God's renewed blessing. The territorial and imperialistic emphasis of the passage is embarrassing to the Christian reader. But it is a piece of general Old Testament theology whereby the blessing of God was intimately bound up with material possession of the land promise. Accordingly, the land had a sacramental significance. Spiritual restoration to divine favor is inextricably linked with material restoration to Palestine. Again, that's what I said earlier. Many an observer of modern history has been so impressed by the establishment of the State of Israel as to hail it as the long-awaited fulfillment of prophecy of the present type. Unfortunately, this relation of ancient hope to modern happenings labors under the theological difficulty that in its contemporary form, Israel is a secular state, inspired by nationalism rather than by religion. Diverse eschatological expectations among Christians are influenced by presuppositions concerning the relation between the Old and the New Covenant. Certainly, the New Testament transmutes the territory into the celestial, the material into the supernatural. What does that mean? It means the New Testament, we understand that the territory is transformed into the supernatural, the natural transformed into the supernatural. So it isn't a building, it isn't a piece of land, it is the people. The people of God are the temple. It holds forth the hope of a heavenly country. Jerusalem and a temple which Christ has entered and to which the Christian already has some access. Here we have no permanent city, but we look for the one that is to come. This was written by a Jewish Christian in Hebrews 13:14. Since it is Christians, whether of Gentile or Jewish stock, who are henceforth the heirs of Abraham and the promises made to him, according to Paul's teachings in Galatians and Romans, it is difficult to see how any Christian can contemplate turning the theological clock back to a limited pre-Christian point of expectations, merely referring to a piece of land. What we Christians must remember in reading this book, it isn't that this isn't a future hope of natural territorial expansion. Rather, as part of the believing community, it is far wider and higher than Obadiah was able to understand during his time. It is a realization of a new heavens and a new earth, future made manifest in the present-day church as its foreshadow. We can rejoice in this and celebrate the family which the temple of God is comprised of. I want to thank you for listening to this short book series, and I will see you next time.
We have reached the end of today's Bible Wire podcast. If you'd like more information about our church, or if you'd like more resources related to this podcast, you can find us online at www.zionfellowship.net. We're also available on social media. Look for Zion Fellowship. Thank you for joining us today on Bible Wire.